You invited him as a joke, Dad, but you might want to listen before the room judges him. The sentence hadn't even finished echoing through the marble ballroom before the double doors opened. Conversation stalled. Crystal glasses paused midair. At the far end of the grand hall, beneath chandeliers glowing like captured stars, a man stepped inside with the kind of calm that didn't belong to someone who had just been made the evening's entertainment. His name was Marcus Reed, 38 years old, a black single father from the south side of Atlanta. The kind of man most people in rooms like this assumed they understood before he even spoke a word. Tonight, however, the assumptions began unraveling the moment he crossed the threshold. The Harrington Foundation's annual charity gala was not a place where outsiders usually appeared. 300 guests filled the hall: venture capitalists, tech founders, real estate moguls, senators, and the occasional celebrity who knew how to turn a fundraiser into a headline. Tailored tuxedos moved through the crowd like a slow black tide. Diamond bracelets flashed beneath warm chandelier light. A grand piano murmured quietly near the stage, its notes drifting across the polished floor like a soundtrack to wealth. And standing at the center of it all was Victor Harrington, the millionaire host whose name was printed across every banner in the room. Tall, silver-haired, perfectly composed, Victor Harrington was a man who had built an empire of glass towers and investment funds stretching from New York to Dallas. People admired him. Some feared him. Most laughed at his jokes because it was simply easier that way. Tonight, one of those jokes had arrived in person. Ladies and gentlemen, Victor had announced only minutes earlier, lifting a glass of sparkling water with the confident smile of a man used to owning the room. I thought our charity evening needed a special guest. The crowd had leaned in politely, curious. A hard-working single father, Victor continued, his tone light, almost playful. Proof that opportunity exists for everyone if they simply try hard enough. A few guests chuckled. Others exchanged uncertain looks. No one quite knew where the joke ended. But Victor did, because he knew something the guests did not. Marcus Reed was supposed to walk into this room uncomfortable, out of place, grateful just to stand near the buffet table and shake a few wealthy hands. That was the expectation. That was the script. Except the script shattered the moment Marcus took his third step across the ballroom floor. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly fitted, simple but unmistakably elegant. His shoulders were relaxed, his gaze steady, not the stiff posture of someone hoping to impress the powerful, but the quiet composure of someone who had already learned that dignity wasn't something another person could give or take away. Conversation slowed. A woman near the bar lowered her glass halfway. A hedge fund manager turned slightly, studying the newcomer with unexpected curiosity. Even the pianist hesitated, missing a note before recovering again. Marcus Reed continued walking, unhurried, as if the thousand eyes now fixed on him were nothing more than passing streetlights on a familiar road. Victor Harrington noticed it too. The lack of hesitation, the lack of apology. And for the first time that evening, the smile at the corner of the millionaire's mouth began to tighten, just a little. Because the man who had just entered his ballroom did not look like a punchline. He looked like a king who had simply chosen the wrong palace to visit. Marcus Reed did not slow down as he crossed the ballroom, but inside his mind the noise of the evening faded into something quieter, something familiar, the steady rhythm of patience he had practiced for years. Crowded rooms had never impressed him. Expensive ceilings had never intimidated him. Because Marcus Reed had spent most of his life in places where respect was earned through quiet consistency rather than appearances. 5 years earlier his world had looked very different. Back then his mornings started before sunrise in a small 2-bedroom house in East Atlanta where the coffee maker clicked on at 5:30 and the kitchen window looked out toward a narrow street lined with maple trees. That was where his daughter Lily would sit at the table swinging her legs while finishing a bowl of cereal before school. Lily Reed was 8 years old now, bright-eyed, endlessly curious, the kind of child who asked questions about everything from how engines worked to why the moon sometimes followed their truck home at night. Marcus answered every question the same way he approached the rest of his life, slowly, carefully, making sure she understood not just the answer but the reason behind it. During the day, Marcus worked at a neighborhood auto garage called Parker & Sons where the smell of motor oil and rubber tires hung permanently in the air. The shop was not glamorous, but the customers trusted him because he never recommended repairs people did not need, and he never rushed through a job just to move on to the next one. In a city filled with quick profits and shortcuts, Marcus had built a reputation for something simple: reliability. After the garage closed, he drove across town to a quiet office complex where he worked night security 3 evenings a week. The extra shift was not easy, but it helped pay Lily's school tuition and the piano lessons she had begged for after hearing a musician play in the park one afternoon. Marcus never complained about the long hours. When people asked how he managed 2 jobs and still found time to attend every school meeting and weekend soccer game, he simply shrugged and said the same thing. When someone depends on you, the math becomes simple. That was the man now walking through Victor Harrington's ballroom. A man who knew exactly how heavy responsibility could feel and exactly how strong quiet determination could become over time. Across the hall, several guests continued watching him with cautious curiosity. Some whispered behind raised hands. Others tilted their heads as if trying to solve a puzzle that had just been placed in front of them. Marcus noticed none of it. His attention moved briefly across the elegant room, taking in the tall windows overlooking the city skyline, the servers gliding silently between tables, the large portrait of Victor Harrington hanging above the stage like a painted reminder of who controlled this world. None of it changed the pace of his steps, because Marcus Reed had not come to prove he belonged in this room. He had come because someone had asked him to be here. And when Marcus Reed gave his word to show up, he always did. Victor Harrington had spent 30 years building rooms like this one. Rooms where every chair, every guest, every conversation moved according to quiet rules that he understood better than anyone else. The ballroom inside the Harrington Grand Hotel was his favorite stage. 200 feet of polished marble stretched beneath a ceiling painted with soft gold patterns that reflected the chandelier light like calm water. Tall windows framed the Manhattan skyline where the late evening glow of the city shimmered against the glass towers Victor himself had financed years earlier. Everything in the room carried his signature. The foundation banners, the guest list, even the orchestra playing near the stage had been selected personally by his assistant weeks earlier. Victor Harrington believed in preparation because preparation meant control, and control meant respect. For decades, that formula had never failed him. Investors trusted him. Politicians listened to him. Journalists quoted him. And tonight's charity gala was supposed to be another flawless demonstration of that influence. The Harrington Foundation had raised millions for education and community programs across the country, and Victor made certain every guest in the room knew it. His voice carried easily across the crowd whenever he spoke, confident without needing to raise its volume. A few minutes earlier, he had been standing near the center table speaking with Daniel Cole, a longtime business partner whose hedge fund handled several of Victor's largest real estate investments. Daniel was a tall man with sharp glasses and a habit of studying people as if they were numbers on a balance sheet. When Victor had mentioned the special guest arriving later that evening, Daniel had laughed softly, not loudly enough to attract attention, but just enough to signal he understood the joke. Victor enjoyed those moments, the subtle ones where only a few people understood the message behind his words. In Victor's world, humor often worked best when it came wrapped in politeness. Every event needs a little unpredictability, Victor had said earlier, swirling the water in his glass while watching the crowd. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Unpredictability or entertainment? Victor smiled thinly. Sometimes those are the same thing. What Victor had not expected was the reaction, now spreading quietly through the room as Marcus Reed continued walking across the ballroom floor. Daniel noticed it first. He leaned slightly toward Victor and lowered his voice. That man does not look like he knows he is the joke. Victor's eyes followed Marcus again. The calm walk, the steady shoulders, the absence of hesitation. Victor Harrington had spent his life reading people in seconds. Investors who pretended confidence. Politicians who hid fear behind smiles. Negotiators who tried to mask desperation during billion-dollar deals. Marcus Reed did not match any of those patterns. The man walking toward the center of the room did not appear nervous or defensive or even impressed. He looked composed, as if the chandeliers, the orchestra, and the hundreds of wealthy eyes watching him were simply part of the evening weather. Victor felt something unfamiliar stir behind his polished smile. Not anger, not embarrassment, something closer to curiosity. Because a man who walked into a room like this without hesitation usually knew something the room did not. Marcus Reed stopped a few steps short of the center of the ballroom. not because he felt uncertain, but because the quiet attention gathering around him had become impossible to ignore. Conversations that had once filled the room with polite laughter now faded into low murmurs. A woman near the champagne table leaned toward her friend and whispered something behind a raised hand. Across the hall, a pair of young executives exchanged quick glances, their curiosity sharpening as they tried to understand why the man Victor Harrington had introduced as a casual novelty looked so completely at ease under the glow of the chandeliers. Marcus noticed the shift, but did not react to it. He had spent enough years in unfamiliar rooms to understand that people often spoke with their eyes long before they spoke with their voices. Instead, he turned slightly toward the bar at the far side of the ballroom, where a polished marble counter reflected the golden light above. The bartender, a young man in a crisp white jacket, straightened slightly as Marcus approached, unsure for a moment whether this guest was part of the usual circle of investors and donors or someone new to the evening's carefully arranged hierarchy. Marcus rested his hand lightly against the counter. His voice when he spoke was calm and steady. "Just water, please." The bartender nodded quickly and filled a tall glass from a chilled bottle before sliding it forward across the marble surface. Marcus thanked him with a small nod before lifting the glass and taking a slow sip. The cool water tasted clean and ordinary, a quiet contrast to the glittering room surrounding him. From the center of the ballroom, Victor Harrington watched the moment carefully. At first, the millionaire had expected Marcus Reed to hover awkwardly near the entrance or drift toward the buffet tables where a few other guests without obvious connections had already gathered. That was usually how outsiders behaved in rooms built on status. They stayed close to the edges. They waited for someone important to acknowledge them. But Marcus had done something different. He had walked directly through the room as though the space belonged to no one in particular. Victor noticed it. Daniel Cole noticed it too. "Your guest seems comfortable," Daniel murmured beside him, adjusting the cuff of his jacket. Victor did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on Marcus across the room. Comfort was not the word Victor would have chosen. Confidence was closer. Not loud confidence or arrogant confidence, but something quieter. The kind that came from someone who had spent years solving real problems instead of trying to impress strangers. Around them, the orchestra resumed, playing softly, the piano notes drifting once more through the hall. A few guests began speaking again, though their voices remained lower than before. Something in the atmosphere had shifted, subtle but undeniable. Victor Harrington slowly set his glass down on the nearest table and adjusted the sleeve of his tailored jacket. The evening had been designed with precision, every moment planned weeks in advance, every introduction carefully arranged. Yet the man now standing calmly at the bar had stepped into the middle of that carefully prepared scene without following any of the expected rules. Victor began walking toward him, his polished shoes tapping lightly against the marble floor. The crowd parted slightly as he passed, guests turning their heads to follow the movement. Because everyone in the room understood one thing clearly. When Victor Harrington chose to approach someone personally, the conversation that followed usually changed the direction of the entire evening. Victor Harrington approached with the calm authority of a man who had spent decades being the center of every room he entered. The quiet ripple of attention followed him across the ballroom floor like a shadow. Conversations softened again as guests turned subtly, pretending not to stare while clearly doing exactly that. Marcus Reed noticed the movement long before Victor reached him. He finished his sip of water and set the glass gently on the marble counter, the faint clink of glass against stone barely audible beneath the soft music of the piano. When he turned, Victor Harrington was already standing a few feet away, his posture relaxed, his expression polished into the polite smile that had helped close billion-dollar deals across the country. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. Victor studied Marcus carefully, the same way he studied contracts before signing them. Up close, the details became clearer. The suit was tailored but not extravagant. The shoes were well cared for but practical. Marcus's hands carried faint calluses that no amount of evening lighting could hide. Hands that worked. Hands that built things rather than merely signing documents about them. Victor finally broke the silence. "Mr. Reed," he said, his voice smooth enough to carry authority without needing to rise above the music. "I trust you were able to find the place without difficulty." Marcus met his gaze calmly. The directions were clear. Victor nodded slightly as though acknowledging a small success. "Good. This city can be confusing if you are not used to navigating it. A few nearby guests leaned closer without appearing obvious, pretending to adjust their drinks while listening. Victor's smile widened a fraction. "Tell me, Marcus," he continued, allowing the first name to fall casually into the conversation as if they were old acquaintances. "What do you think of the evening so far?" Marcus glanced briefly around the ballroom. The chandeliers, the orchestra, the guests moving in tailored jackets and glittering gowns. His voice, when he answered, remained even. "It is impressive." Victor lifted an eyebrow slightly. Impressive is one way to describe it. He gestured toward the room with an open hand. 300 guests, nearly $10 million raised for charity tonight alone. It takes a certain level of experience to organize something like this. Marcus nodded once. "It does." Victor tilted his head, watching him more closely now. "And what kind of experience do you bring to a room like this, Mr. Reed?" The question sounded casual, but the pause that followed stretched longer than the music between piano notes. A nearby couple stopped speaking entirely. Daniel Cole, standing several yards away, folded his arms quietly as he watched the exchange unfold. Marcus did not rush his answer. He rested one hand lightly against the edge of the bar and looked directly at Victor Harrington. The kind that shows up when someone asks. Victor's smile held, but something behind his eyes shifted slightly. The response had not followed the direction he expected. Not defensive, not apologetic, simply honest. Victor let out a small breath through his nose, almost amused. "Well," he said, raising his glass again as though continuing. A performance that had suddenly become more interesting. "Then I suppose we should make sure the evening gives you something worth remembering." Around them the quiet attention of the room deepened. Because everyone watching could feel it now. The conversation Victor Harrington thought he controlled had begun moving in a direction he had not planned. The music in the ballroom continued, but the rhythm of the evening had quietly shifted. People were still holding their drinks, still standing beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. Yet their attention had narrowed toward the small circle forming around Marcus Reed and Victor Harrington. No one announced it. No one interrupted the orchestra. But the air had changed in the subtle way a room changes when something important is about to happen. Victor Harrington studied Marcus for another moment before speaking again. His voice remained smooth, but the tone carried a slightly sharper curiosity now. "You said you came because someone asked you to," he said slowly. "That is interesting, Mr. Reed, because the guest list for this event was arranged very carefully." Marcus did not react to the weight behind the words. He simply nodded once. "Yes, I know." Victor tilted his head slightly. "Do you?" A few nearby guests exchanged quiet glances. Daniel Cole remained where he stood several yards away, his arms still folded, his expression thoughtful now rather than amused. Victor rested one hand lightly against the bar as though settling into a conversation that had become unexpectedly intriguing. "You see," he continued, "people do not usually attend this event without a clear connection to the foundation. Investors, board members, policy advisors. People with a long history in our network." Marcus listened without interruption. Victor allowed a brief pause to stretch between them before finishing the thought. "So naturally, I became curious when I saw your name added to the list." Marcus lifted the glass of water again and took a slow sip before answering. "Curiosity can be useful." Victor gave a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Indeed it can." The piano notes drifted softly across the room again, echoing against the tall windows that framed the glowing skyline of Manhattan beyond the glass. For a moment, the only sound near them was the quiet hum of conversation from distant tables. Victor leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough that the nearby guests had to lean subtly to hear. "Tell me something honestly, Mr. Reed," he said. "Do you know who you are standing in front of?" Marcus met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes." Victor raised an eyebrow. "And that does not make you uncomfortable?" Marcus considered the question for a brief second, not in confusion but in quiet reflection. Then he shook his head once. "No." Victor studied him again, the faint lines around his eyes tightening slightly. "Most people would feel a certain pressure standing in a room like this." Marcus placed the empty glass back onto the marble counter. His voice remained calm, steady, and unmistakably sincere. "Pressure usually comes from trying to be someone else." The words settled into the air between them. Victor Harrington did not respond immediately. For the first time since Marcus Reed had walked into the ballroom, The millionaire seemed to pause without a prepared answer. Around them, the quiet circle of listeners grew just a little larger as more guests drifted subtly closer. Because what had started as an amusing moment inside a carefully planned gala had slowly become something else entirely. A conversation no one in the room had expected to witness. The quiet that followed Marcus Reed's last words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. For a moment, Victor Harrington simply looked at him, the faint smile still resting on his face, but no longer carrying the same easy confidence it had earlier in the evening. Around them, the subtle ring of listeners had grown thicker. Guests who had once been scattered across the ballroom now stood with careful stillness, pretending to focus on their drinks while their attention remained fixed on the exchange unfolding beside the marble bar. Victor finally exhaled slowly through his nose, then straightened slightly and allowed his polished composure to return. "Well," he said, his tone light again though the edge of curiosity had not disappeared. "It is refreshing to meet someone who feels so comfortable in unfamiliar company." Marcus did not answer immediately. His gaze moved briefly toward the tall windows overlooking the city lights far below before returning calmly to Victor. "Company becomes familiar once you listen long enough," he said. Victor tilted his head slightly, as if weighing the meaning of the words. For a man who spent most of his time negotiating billion-dollar projects, he was used to people choosing their sentences carefully around him. Marcus Reed did not sound careful. He sounded certain. Victor glanced toward the stage where the orchestra continued playing, the piano drifting gently through the hall. Then he looked back at Marcus. "You mentioned earlier that someone asked you to attend tonight," Victor said. "That is the detail that still interests me." Marcus nodded once. "I remember." Victor gave a small, patient smile. "Perhaps you would be kind enough to explain it." Marcus folded his hands loosely in front of him, not defensive, simply relaxed. "Your daughter invited me." The sentence settled into the quiet space around them like a small stone dropped into still water. Several nearby guests blinked in surprise. Daniel Cole's folded arms slowly loosened as his attention sharpened. Victor Harrington did not move for a moment. His expression remained composed, but the lines around his eyes tightened slightly. "My daughter," he repeated calmly. Marcus nodded again. "Olivia Harrington." Victor's gaze shifted briefly across the room, as though expecting to see her appear nearby. Olivia Harrington had arrived earlier in the evening, but had spent most of the event speaking with foundation donors near the stage. Victor looked back at Marcus, the faint smile now replaced by something closer to careful focus. "That is interesting," he said slowly. "Because Olivia did not mention inviting anyone outside our foundation circle tonight." Marcus did not appear concerned by the doubt in Victor's voice. "She asked me yesterday." Victor watched him another moment before speaking again. "And why would my daughter invite you to a private charity gala attended by half the city's business leaders?" Marcus held his gaze without hesitation. "Because last year I helped her when she needed it." The piano missed a single note somewhere across the ballroom before quickly recovering. Victor Harrington said nothing. For the first time since Marcus Reed had stepped through the doors of the ballroom, the millionaire host looked genuinely uncertain about what he might hear next. Victor Harrington did not speak immediately after Marcus Reed finished his sentence. The quiet that followed seemed to ripple outward through the ballroom like a slow-moving wave. Guests who had only been half listening now turned more openly. Even the servers passing between tables slowed their steps slightly as they sensed the shift in attention near the bar. Victor's expression remained composed, but the careful confidence that had defined his posture earlier in the evening was beginning to soften around the edges. "You helped her," Victor repeated slowly, as if testing the shape of the words before accepting them. Marcus nodded once. "Yes." Victor studied him for another moment, searching for exaggeration or performance in his face, and finding neither. Marcus Reed stood the same way he had since entering the room, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who did not feel the need to impress anyone. "When exactly did this happen?" Victor asked. Marcus glanced briefly toward the large windows overlooking the city lights before answering. "Last winter." The memory returned to him easily. A cold evening in Atlanta after sunset, when the wind carried the sharp smell of rain through the streets. Marcus had just finished locking the garage for the night, when he noticed a young woman standing near the edge of the parking lot beside a car that refused to start. She had been calm but clearly frustrated, trying to make sense of the engine while speaking quietly on her phone. Marcus had walked over simply because it felt like the right thing to do. "Do you mind if I take a look?" he had asked. Within minutes, he realized the issue was simple: a drained battery and a loose connection beneath the hood. 10 minutes later, the engine started again with a smooth hum. The young woman had thanked him with obvious relief. Before leaving, she introduced herself. Olivia Harrington. Marcus had recognized the name only later when he returned home and saw a news article about the Harrington Foundation opening a new education program downtown. Back in the ballroom, Victor listened carefully as Marcus finished explaining. "She offered to pay for the repair," Marcus said calmly. "I told her it was not necessary." Victor's brow tightened slightly. "And she remembered that months later?" Marcus nodded. "She said it mattered to her." The sound of heels against marble echoed softly across the room. Victor turned his head. Olivia Harrington was walking toward them from the far side of the ballroom. Her expression focused as she noticed the quiet circle of guests gathered near her father. She stopped a few feet away and looked from Victor to Marcus. A small smile appeared on her face. "I was wondering when you two would finally meet," she said. Victor turned fully toward her. "Olivia," he said carefully, "did you invite Mr. Reed tonight?" She nodded without hesitation. "Yes, I did." The room seemed to hold its breath again. Olivia looked toward Marcus with warm recognition before continuing. "Because last year when I needed help, he was the only person who stopped to offer it." Victor Harrington remained silent for a long moment. For the first time that evening, the carefully planned script of the gala had completely slipped out of his control. Victor Harrington remained still as Olivia's words settled over the gathered crowd. For years he had been the one shaping the rhythm of rooms like this, guiding conversations with practiced confidence, controlling the direction of every moment. Yet now the center of attention no longer belonged to him. It rested quietly between his daughter and the man standing calmly beside the marble bar. Victor looked from Olivia to Marcus Reed again, this time not with calculation, but with something slower and more thoughtful. Around them the guests waited in near silence, their curiosity no longer hidden. The orchestra continued playing softly, but even the musicians seemed aware that the true focus of the evening had shifted away from the stage. Victor finally cleared his throat gently. "You never told me about this," he said to Olivia. His voice was not angry. It carried more surprise than anything else. Olivia met his gaze calmly. "It was not a dramatic story," she replied. "My car would not start. Marcus helped me. He did not ask for anything in return." Victor's eyes moved back to Marcus. "You did not recognize her?" he asked. Marcus shook his head slightly. "Not at first." Victor folded his arms slowly, studying him with the same intensity he once reserved for complicated negotiations. "And when you realized who she was?" Marcus answered simply. It did not change the situation. The sentence hung in the air like a quiet truth no one in the room could ignore. Victor glanced briefly across the ballroom. Hundreds of guests stood beneath the glowing chandeliers, people who spent their lives measuring influence and advantage. Yet the man standing before him had acted months earlier without knowing who he was helping and without expecting any recognition afterward. Victor exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing as something inside his perspective shifted. "Mr. Reed," he said at last, his voice steady but noticeably different from the polished tone he had used earlier. "It appears I misunderstood the reason for your presence tonight." Marcus did not react with triumph or satisfaction. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a small correction rather than a dramatic revelation. Victor extended his hand across the space between them. The movement was simple but unmistakable. "In that case," Victor continued, "I owe you a proper welcome." Marcus looked at the offered hand for a moment before shaking it firmly. The gesture was brief yet sincere. A quiet murmur moved through the nearby crowd as guests exchanged surprised looks. Daniel Cole lowered his folded arms, watching with an expression that had shifted from skepticism to quiet respect. Olivia smiled softly, relieved that the evening had turned in a direction she had hoped for when she sent the invitation. Victor released Marcus's hand and glanced once more around the ballroom. For the first time since the gala began, he seemed less concerned with controlling the atmosphere of the room and more interested in understanding it. Marcus Reed stood calmly beside the bar, the same composed man who had entered the hall earlier without hesitation. Outside the tall windows, the lights of the city stretched across the dark skyline, steady and endless. Inside the ballroom, the conversation slowly returned, but the tone had changed. Because everyone who witnessed the moment understood something simple and powerful. Respect had entered the room not through wealth or influence, but through the quiet dignity of a man who never needed either to stand tall.